The most absurd was how they justified all this economic discrimination. Women couldn't handle money because they were too emotional, yet records show male merchants regularly got into sword fights over minor price disagreements. Women were too weak to run businesses, yet they were somehow strong enough to do backbreaking farm work. Women were too simple to understand finances, yet they were often the ones keeping their households from going bankrupt while their husbands bought yet another unnecessary sword. One account shows a wife carefully managing her family's finances for 20 years while her husband invested their savings in a foolproof plan to find mermaids. But you know what happens when you tell someone they can't do something for long enough? They get really, really clever at finding ways around the rules. And medieval women? They turned outsmarting the system into an art form. Being clever wasn't just a bonus for medieval women, it was a survival skill. When men create every rule in the book, you either learn to read between the lines or get crushed by them. And medieval women, they got so good at finding loopholes, they could have taught modern lawyers a thing or two. Medieval records are full of women who turned oppression into opportunity, usually while the men were too busy congratulating themselves to notice. Take education, for example. Girls weren't supposed to learn to read because it might give them dangerous ideas. But noble women needed to manage household accounts, so they convinced everyone that learning numbers wasn't really reading. One clever noblewoman taught her entire household to read by claiming she was just teaching them to count prayer beads. By the time anyone caught on, her servants were better educated than most priests. She even started a trend of prayer counting classes that spread through 3 counties before the church realized they'd accidentally created an underground literacy network. The business world saw some particularly creative solutions. Since women couldn't officially run shops, they became really good at running them unofficially. Records from 1367 show a man's business that was mysteriously only open when his wife was there. The husband spent most of his time napping in the back room while his wife did all the work. But hey, technically, it was his shop. When customers asked why he never seemed to know anything about his own business, he'd say he was practicing delegation. Medieval management at its finest. The wife eventually started charging people extra to wake him up for questions, creating medieval Europe's first consulting fee. Some women got even more creative with their workarounds. One genius in the 14th century London ran her entire merchant empire through a network of cats. Yes, cats. She trained them to follow specific trade routes, carrying messages hidden in their collars. The local guards never thought to check the cats, because who would suspect a cat of running an international trading network? When she was finally caught, the court records show more confusion than anger. One judge actually asked if the cat should be put on trial too. She got off with a warning because nobody could figure out how to write illegal feline commerce in Latin. The whole women are too emotional thing backfired beautifully sometimes. Since everyone expected women to be dramatic, they could get away with outrageous behavior that would have landed men in serious trouble. Records show a woman avoided paying taxes by bursting into tears and wailing about her poor little chickens whenever the tax collector came around. He was so uncomfortable with female emotions that he'd leave without collecting. She kept this up for 12 years. Her poor little chickens probably owned half the town by then. The best part? She didn't even own chickens. Speaking of playing the emotion card, some women turned the whole hysteria diagnosis into a superpower. Can't attend a boring social event? Hysteria. Don't want to marry that creepy old lord? Hysteria. Need a day off from pretending to be bad at everything? You guessed it, hysteria. One noblewoman reportedly avoided an arranged marriage by developing a mysterious ailment that made her speak in riddles whenever her unwanted suitor was around. Miraculously, she recovered completely when he married someone else. Her family physician noted that it was the most convenient case of hysteria he'd ever seen. The really smart ones used men's egos against them. They'd praise their husbands for brilliant ideas that were actually their own, run entire estates while pretending to just help a little, and solve major problems while making men think they'd figured it out themselves. A woman in 1382 fixed her town's entire water supply system, but convinced everyone it was her intellectually challenged brother's idea. Because they'd rather believe a man was secretly a genius than admit a woman knew about engineering. She later used the same technique to redesign the town's defensive walls, cure a cattle plague, and invent a new type of plow, all credited to various male relatives who could barely dress themselves. The statistics are pretty telling. In towns where women weren't allowed to own property, there's a suspicious number of businesses owned by sickly men who needed their wives to handle everything. In one French village, 60% of the male business owners were reportedly too delicate to handle their own affairs. Either medieval men were remarkably fragile, or medieval women were remarkably good at working the system. One town's records show an epidemic of masculine frailty that mysteriously affected only men whose wives were good at mathematics. But perhaps the most impressive feat was how they passed these skills down through generations. Mothers taught daughters the art of playing dumb while being smart, of following rules while breaking them, and of smiling sweetly while running circles around the men who underestimated them. One book of household tips from 1375 is actually a coded manual for getting around male authority. Its recipe for sweet bread is really instructions for hiding money from your husband. The section on proper flower arrangement contains detailed instructions for running a secret business. Even the embroidery patterns were actually maps showing safe routes for women travelers. All this mental gymnastics had an interesting side effect. Medieval women got really good at reading people and situations. When you have to outsmart half the population just to get through your day, you develop some serious skills. Some historians argue that medieval women invented psychology, not because they were naturally more emotional, but because they had to become experts at managing male egos just to survive. Speaking of marriage, you wouldn't believe the creative ways women found to handle being legally considered their husband's property. Let's just say that being someone's property works a lot better when that someone doesn't know what they actually own. Marriage in medieval times was about as romantic as a business contract, because that's exactly what it was. Your father would basically sell you to the highest bidder, and boom, you're someone's wife. But there was one escape route that many women secretly hoped for: becoming a widow. Sure, it wasn't exactly a fun way to gain freedom, but when your options are be property or be free, you work with what you've got. And oh boy, did medieval women work that system like pros. The numbers tell a fascinating story. In one English town in 1385, records show that widows owned 40% of all businesses, despite making up only 15% of the population. Meanwhile, married women owned exactly 0 businesses, because legally they couldn't own anything. One widow actually bought her late husband's business at auction, the same business she'd been running for him for 20 years while he spent their money on hunting dogs. The court records note that she paid for it with money she'd secretly saved while pretending her husband's pants needed constant expensive repairs. Widows had powers that married women could only dream about. They could own property, run businesses, make contracts, and, here's the kicker, refuse to remarry. That last one was huge. Records show some younger widows practically racing to set up their businesses before their families could marry them off again. One clever widow in France started a mourning accessories business because nobody would pressure a professional mourner to remarry. That would just be tasteless. She became so successful that other widows started copying her idea, creating what historians call the medieval widow fashion industry. The freedom was so desirable that some women got creative about achieving widow status. There's this fantastic court record from 1392 where a woman convinced her elderly husband to become a monk. He got to spend his final years in peaceful prayer. She got her independence, and everyone pretended it was all very holy and not at all a clever divorce scheme. Medieval problems require medieval solutions. Another woman convinced her husband that managing their business was damaging his masculine dignity, so he nobly handed her all control and spent his days writing poetry about how busy he was. But here's where it gets really interesting. Widows formed their own support networks. They'd help each other set up businesses, share legal advice, and warn each other about men looking for wealthy widow marriages. In some towns, they even had secret signals. Wearing your belt a certain way meant, "I'm not interested in remarrying. Stop asking." One group of widows in Italy started a fake curse rumor that marrying a widow would give you bad luck. It worked so well that local men started crossing the street to avoid them. The widows reportedly found this hilarious and would sometimes walk in groups just to watch entire streets of men suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The church wasn't too happy about all these independent women running around. They kept preaching about how widows should live quiet lives of prayer and definitely not become successful business owners. But what could they do? Even they had to admit that forcing widows to remarry wasn't very Christian. One frustrated priest wrote that widows are becoming altogether too merry in their mourning. Translation: these women are enjoying their freedom way too much. Some widows would donate just enough to the church to keep the priests quiet while spending the rest on expanding their businesses. Rich widows were particularly powerful. Without a husband to legally control their wealth, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted. One widow in 1378 bought an entire village just because the local lord had been rude to her. Another funded a cathedral construction but insisted that all the angel statues be female. The church couldn't exactly refuse. Money was money, even if it came from a suspiciously independent woman. She even had them add a small carved cat in the corner that looked suspiciously like her late husband's least favorite pet. Some widows got so good at the independence game that they started teaching other women their tricks. They'd hire married women to work in their shops, giving them a taste of economic freedom. They'd coincidentally need help managing their accounts just when a neighbor's daughter showed interest in learning math. One widow ran what was officially a grief counseling group, but was actually a business strategy meeting for other women looking to gain independence. The local authorities finally caught on when they noticed that the grieving women were all leaving with suspicious amounts of business knowledge and accounting skills. Men kept trying to create laws to control widows, but it never quite worked. Make a law saying widows can't own taverns? They'd open dining rooms instead. Ban them from money lending? They'd create elaborate gift exchange systems. One widow responded to a law against women owning ships by registering her fleet in her dead husband's name. Because technically, the law didn't say anything about zombie ship owners. She even kept a portrait of him in her office, which she'd consult loudly about business decisions whenever officials visited. For many women, seeing their mothers or aunts transform from obedient wives into independent widows was their first glimpse of what freedom looked like. Young girls would secretly hope to marry someone old, while their parents thought they were being admirably self-sacrificing. Medieval marriage strategies could get pretty dark. There are actual records of girls praying for a kind husband who wouldn't live too long. Of course, not every widow had it great, but compared to being married, widowhood was often the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery. Unless, that is, someone decided you'd gained a bit too much independence and started whispering that word that struck fear into every medieval woman's heart. Calling someone a witch in medieval times wasn't like calling someone a witch today. It wasn't a joke about someone being cranky or having a black cat. Nope. It was basically the medieval version of delete her whole life. And guess what? The people most likely to be called witches were women who didn't fit into neat little boxes of what men thought they should be. The accusation was such a powerful weapon that just whispering the word witch could destroy a woman's entire life faster than you can say medieval justice. The statistics are mind-blowing. In one German town in 1387, every single woman accused of witchcraft had either refused marriage, inherited property, or knew how to read. Suspicious much, the town records showed that the local judge actually wrote, "The more independent the woman, the more likely she deals with the devil." Because obviously the only way a woman could support herself was through satanic book clubs. They even had a special tax on single women called the witch risk fee, basically charging women for the crime of not having a man to control them. Here's a real case that shows how ridiculous things got. A woman named Martha in 1391 was accused of witchcraft because her cows produced more milk than her neighbor's cows. The evidence against her? She talked to her cows kindly instead of hitting them, and she kept their barn clean. Revolutionary stuff, right? The court seriously argued that no woman could be that good at farming without demonic help. Martha's defense was amazing. She pointed out that if the devil was helping her, he was doing a terrible job since she still had to wake up at dawn to milk the cows herself. She also asked why Satan, with all his supposed powers, couldn't at least invent a better milking stool. The whole witch thing was really just a catch-all term for woman we don't like. Healer who knows which herbs cure fevers. Witch. Midwives with a high survival rate for births. Super witch. Woman who's better at business than the local merchants. Witch with a side of evil. One female brewer was accused of witchcraft because her beer was suspiciously good. The suspicious part? Her accusers were all male brewers who'd lost customers to her. The court records actually include a debate about whether making beer taste good was an act of sorcery. The evidence they used to prove witchcraft would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. Own a cat? Witch. Talk to yourself while working? Witch. Good at math? Definitely a witch. One woman was accused because she had unusually clean floors. Apparently, proper housekeeping was satanic. The judge's official ruling stated that no honest woman has time for such excessive cleanliness. Medieval men really said anything to avoid doing chores. Another woman was accused because she didn't get sick during a plague. Obviously, her good health was a sign of dark powers rather than basic hygiene. The witch hunters had some creative theories about how to spot a witch. They claimed witches couldn't cry, and had secret marks on their bodies, also known as birthmarks or freckles. One expert wrote that witches could be identified by their tendency to help others without asking for payment, because obviously only someone in league with the devil would be genuinely kind. He also claimed witches couldn't say the Lord's Prayer backward while hopping on one foot, which, let's be honest, is a challenge for anyone. Once accused, women faced a classic heads I win, tails you lose situation. Deny being a witch? That's exactly what a witch would do. Confess to being a witch? Well, there's your proof. Fight back against your accusers? Witchy behavior? Accept your fate quietly? Suspicious lack of protest? Must be a witch. One woman was accused of using witchcraft to make her husband love her because he defended her in court. The judge actually said, "No man would naturally support his wife without demonic influence." Smart women started taking preventive measures. They deliberately mess up their cooking sometimes or pretend they couldn't read. Some would intentionally keep one corner of their house dusty just to avoid looking too competent. A group of female merchants in France started a brilliant tradition of accidentally dropping things while counting money, just to appear bad at math. Their profits probably took a hit, but hey, better to look clumsy than end up in witch court. One clever woman even started a trend of tripping over her own feet regularly, just to appear less graceful. But the most infuriating part? The same men who accused women of being witches would secretly come to them for help. Got a toothache? Go to the witch who knows about herbs. Wife having a difficult pregnancy? Better call that evil midwife. Can't balance your accounts? Time to visit that suspicious widow who's good with numbers. Records show that one famous witch hunter regularly consulted a wise woman for his back pain while actively prosecuting other healers. When questioned about this hypocrisy, he claimed he was monitoring her for signs of wickedness for 15 years of back treatments. All these witch hunts had a chilling effect on women's independence that lasted for centuries. After all, who would want to stand out or show their skills if it meant risking everything? And speaking of lasting effects, you wouldn't believe how many of these medieval ideas about controlling women snuck their way into modern times. Sure, those medieval rules about women are ancient history, just like your great-aunt's fashion choices, right? Wrong. Many of those old ideas stuck around longer than that weird Jell-O salad recipe from the 1950s, and some of them are still causing trouble today, like that one relative who keeps bringing up politics at Thanksgiving dinner. Let's do some time traveling. Women couldn't own property in medieval times, and guess what? In some parts of America, women couldn't get credit cards without their husband's permission until 1974. That's right. Your grandma might have had an easier time buying a castle in 1374 than getting a MasterCard in 1974. At least medieval women could pay for things with chickens. The workplace is another gold mine of leftover medieval thinking. Remember how medieval guilds made special rules to keep women out of certain jobs? Fast forward to 1973, when women still couldn't be airline pilots in most countries. The reason? Women are too emotional to fly planes. Because apparently, men never lose their cool, except when their favorite sports team loses, or someone takes their parking spot, or their sandwich has the wrong kind of mustard. The education gap is particularly wild. Medieval folks thought women's brains would explode if they learned too much. While we're not quite that dramatic anymore, until the 1970s, many top universities wouldn't admit women because it might distract the male students. As if guys needed help getting distracted, they were doing just fine on their own, thank you very much. The gender pay gap has medieval roots too. Back then, women were paid half what men earned because their work was considered naturally inferior. Today, women still earn less on average, though now we use fancier words to justify it. Instead of saying women's work is worth less, we say things like market forces and career choices. Same old medieval sandwich, just with different bread. Even modern marriage laws have some medieval DNA. Until surprisingly recently, husbands couldn't legally rape their wives in many countries, because, like in medieval times, wives were considered property. This didn't change in all U.S. states until 1993. That means there are people younger than some pairs of genes who were born before women had full legal protection from their husbands. What's sneaky is how these old ideas keep popping up in new disguises, like when companies say they can't promote women to leadership roles because they might get pregnant and leave. It's just a modern version of medieval guilds saying women couldn't be master craftsmen because they might get married and move away. The excuses got fancier, but the song remains the same. But here's the good news. Just like medieval women found ways to bend those rigid rules, modern women keep pushing back against these outdated ideas. Every time someone says, women can't do that, another woman goes ahead and does it anyway, and usually does it better, just to make a point. The lesson from all this medieval madness? Progress isn't a straight line. It's more like trying to walk home after too much mead. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, occasional falling into a ditch, but eventually getting where you need to go. So the next time someone says, that's just the way things are, remember, they probably said the same thing in 1386. And those medieval women would probably look at us now and say, not bad, but you've still got work to do.